A couple of consequences of the Industrial Revolution here in the United States. One is a regional and political consequence, the rise of the Populist Party. The other is a response to the problems caused by the Industrial Revolution, and that's the rise of the progressives. Before we get into these two groups, I want to remind you that from Lincoln in the 1860s, probably to Teddy Roosevelt in the early 20th century, most Americans could not name a single president. But most Americans probably could name some of the great industrial giants of this time. These captains of industry, as they're sometimes called. Henry Ford, John D. Rockefeller with Standard Oil, Andrew Carnegie with U.S. Steel, Harriman's with the railroads, J.P. Morgan, the great capitalist who financed much of the industrial growth of the country. These are the names that jump out at people during this, what's sometimes referred to as the Gilded Age. We don't know the names of our presidents, particularly during this time. They tend to be overshadowed, shall we say. So I'm going to talk about the populists first. And I want you to be able to distinguish between the populists and the progressives. They're two quite different entities. The populists are a political party. They represent agriculture in the South and in the Midwest. So this is a regional political opposition to the Eastern establishment, shall we say, Eastern bankers and industry. The populists are very distrustful of the system of which they are now taking part. They believe that they are being taken advantage of, perhaps, that they're vulnerable to Eastern bankers, that they're vulnerable to railroads who charge rates that diminish the farmers' profits. And the creation of the Populist Party is in response to this fear. I want to mention a couple things here about the Populist Party platform. You can look at this online. You can just simply Google the Omaha platform, and you can see there the Populist Party and what it stands for and what it desires politically. One of the primary concerns of the populists is the lack of currency. Currency, of course, at this time is based on gold. The limitations of gold limit the currency. And of course, Eastern bankers are fearful of currency running rampant and creating inflation. So the populists are seeking to use silver as well as gold to back the currency. This is a fight between the Western and Southern farmer and the Eastern bankers and industrialists. The populists believe that institutions that operate in an interstate basis, like the railroads, the telegraph lines, they should be owned and operated by the government. The railroads are especially a problem for the populists because these farmers are dependent upon the railroads to take their products back to the markets in the East. And the railroads, of course, it is believed by the populists the railroads are gouging them. The railroad rates are too high. This is cutting deeply into whatever profit these farmers can make. So the populists believe that interstate institutions should be government owned and government run. The populists believe in a graduated or a progressive income tax. That is, the more you make, the more you pay. The populists also introduced certain electoral reforms, referendums, recalls. This gives the people much more hands-on control over their political system. They want a direct election of senators. This may sound strange since we elect them directly today, but we didn't then. Senators were appointed by governors or some other manner, but they were not directly elected. The populists want political power locally and to enhance their political power and their economic power. Populists are looking for shorter hours, work-wise. They're looking for restrictions on immigration. Immigrants tend to compete with farmers. They're looking for easier credit. Again, this goes along with trying to expand the currency by using silver as well as gold to back the currency. They're looking for free delivery of mail. Again, mail is an interstate institution. Now, with these things in mind, I want you to take a look at some of the images that we've put here for you. This first one, the People's Party, and you see Tom Watson of Georgia here. Tom Watson would later be a rabid race baiter, but early in his populist career, he and some of his colleagues attempted to do something that's quite unusual in this country, certainly in the early 20th century is unusual, and that is to link farmers, to link them by race, black and white. Watson would have made the argument that poor whites and poor blacks have more in common with each other than poor whites have in common with rich whites. So they were attempting to, at least early on, the populists were attempting to create a unified political interest where race was thrown out the window. And what was emphasized was their economic interest. Blacks and whites had the same economic interest. They have different skin color, and in this country, skin color generally trumps any other interest. And indeed, Tom Watson and the populists will abandon this interracial unity once they realize that it has no chance of success in elections. You can look at the Omaha platform. It's shown here for you online, and it's here on D2L. It has lists a lot of the policy proposals that I just discussed. And then there's some political or editorial cartoons here that illustrate the role of the Populist Party and how it tends to compete with the Democratic Party. And you can see here William Jennings Bryan portrayed as a giant boa constrictor gobbling up the Democratic Party. Of course, it will work out just the opposite. The Democratic Party will tend to absorb the populist by 1896. And you can look at the election here in 1892. This is really the high point of the populist movement. And you can see that they make inroads in the Midwest and in the far West. But this will be the high point, and the populists will be absorbed essentially by the Democrats. From the populist, a political party, I want to go to the progressives. The progressives are not so much a political party. What they are organizations that are generally in the North, in the Northeast, quite often dominated by women, middle class or upper middle class women with resources and time on their hands. And they are attempting to remedy some of the problems that have been brought about by the Industrial Revolution and this massive urbanization that's taking place. Progressives, and you can see the pictures of them here on D2L, progressives tend to criticize the practices that the Industrial Revolution has encouraged, like child labor. Progressives will point to children working in textile mills and say, well, those children obviously should be in school. They should not be working in the mill. Southern parents tend to tell the progressives to mind their own business, that we need the extra money, that the South is an agricultural part of the country, and you don't need an education to pick cotton or to work in the cotton mills. You see a picture here of Teddy Roosevelt, probably the most famous of our progressive historians. One of the nicknames that Teddy gathered over the years was that of the Trust Buster. This points to monopolies, economic monopolies in this country, and the attempt to break them up. We talked about American exceptionalism, and one of the key tenets is that fear of concentrated power. And you can see it here, whether it's U.S. Steel or Standard Oil or AT&T, any centralized power that has too much control over our economy will tend to be looked at in the most suspicious way and to be broken up. And Teddy Roosevelt is essential or central to this effort. You see here an interesting picture of a group of progressive women. What's the sign they're holding up? Lips that touch liquor shall not touch ours. A nice attack on the sale and consumption of alcohol. Of course, prohibition is one of these causes taken up by the progressives. Prohibition, child labor, and you can look at these photographs at your leisure. Of course, women's suffrage is another issue taken up by the progressives. And you can see here a couple of signs. Women's suffrage headquarters run by men, obviously. President Wilson says this is the time to support women's suffrage. It's difficult to believe, but less than 100 years ago, a little more than half the population of the United States could not vote. Women had traditionally been assigned to the private sphere, men to the public sphere. When women intrude into the public sphere, it created a great deal of consternation in this country. The private sphere is gendered feminine. The public sphere is gendered masculine. So in the public sphere, men conduct politics and commerce, and when women try to intrude into that sphere, it is viewed as a transgression of gender roles. So women's suffrage, the right to vote, ties into this how we gender space in this country. I'll mention another item here that's brought about by industrialization, and that is public health. Many of you have probably heard of Upton Sinclair's famous novel, The Jungle, whereby he reports firsthand on what happens in the Chicago meat packing plants. What's the old saying? Politics is like making sausage. You don't want to see the process, or something like that. At any rate, it was clear that government would probably be the only entity that could step in and ensure that the American people were not being fed and sold unhealthy products. So, Food and Drug Administration is going to emerge here. Here you see a picture of Teddy, the trust buster. You see the large corporations running in fear from him. I'm going to conclude with one poster that sticks in my mind, and it deals with prohibition. It shows a saloon at night with swinging doors, and you can see many people inside the saloon, the smoke and dancing and playing pool. And outside, you can see a young woman with an infant, and it's snowing, and she's lying on the sidewalk, and she's cuddling her infant, and they're both barefooted, and they're barely clothed. And the message, of course, is that while mother and child are freezing and starving, daddy's inside the saloon drinking and playing pool. This is a very effective progressive type poster encouraging people to swear off the consumption of alcohol. And indeed, the amendment will be passed bringing in prohibition. This will go on through the 20s, and prohibition will not be repealed, I believe, until 1933 with President Roosevelt. So the progressives are significant because they are an attempt to mitigate or remedy the difficulties, the new problems that have been brought about by the Industrial Revolution. And we'll stop there. Thank you.